Jumbo, welcome. So glad that you're joining us here on Black Power Media Reloaded. Glad that you're here with us. We come on each Thursday at this time, and our program is Operation Power, people organizing and working for empowerment and respect. My name is Inez Barron. I'm the host along with my husband, the bold, the outspoken, the indomitable, the one, the only, the unbought, and the unbossed.
And most importantly, humble servant, Charles Barron. It is always an honor to be on with my wife of 43 years, the stunningly beautiful and the intellectually brilliant Inez Barron.
Thank you. Once again, you're listening to Operation Power, a voice for Black radical politics and revolutionary change. We're pleased to be a part of the platform, Black Power Media Reloaded. We invite you to see what other programs there are that you might be interested in. We've got an exciting topic today: America's 250 years of hypocrisy. And our guest is none other than the great Gerald Horne, and he'll be joining us shortly. But we do want to start our program with a libation. We understand that we are at this point in our journey towards liberation because of the sacrifices, the work, the intelligence, and all that has been done by the ancestors who have gone before us. We may not know all their names. Some are more knowledgeable known than others, but we want to take this time to recognize all of those who have gone before us and have paved the way. So we do have a libation video that we're going to share with you at this time, honoring our ancestors.
For African people, nothing important happens without a libation. And so for this very important presentation, we begin by the pouring of libation. We pour libation first to our first ancestor, to that hidden one who, though hidden, manifests in all things as all things, that God-goddess idea in the universe by any and all names. To our first ancestor, we pour libation, Ashe. We pour libation too to our ancestors because they were the first people on this planet, mothers and fathers of all mankind, flashpoint of the human family. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to our ancestors because they were the ones who first gave birth to the idea of civilization, knew we would need a form of governance, and they nurtured that idea along the Nile until it reached its zenith in Kemet. There they built these gigantic monuments as evidence of that great civilization, and they carved instructions on the walls of temples and tombs for us, so we would never forget. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to our ancestors because over time they put together all the tenets of civilization, and they took those ideas and left the continent. They were the people of the first Exodus. They left Africa and went all over the world and peopled the world. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. We pour libation too to our ancestors because they did not sit on their laurels. They continued to improve, continued to evolve, and at each point of evolution, they again would leave the continent and settle and resettle the planet. They met themselves coming and going. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to those ancestors because over time, they found themselves the object of a forced exodus when they were kidnapped, shackled, cargoed, shipped out of Africa and enslaved in diasporas around the world. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to the ancestors left at home, the very young, the aged, the infirm, left to reinvent themselves, depleted of us, human resources. But they were enjoined by us in the diasporas, both objects of a global myopia that ruptured the soul of a people as it ravaged a continent. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to those ancestors because over time they began to remember who and what they were. Because no matter where they had been dropped off, they still retained bits and pieces of who and what they were. They retained that African core that described them. They began to remember bits and pieces of a song. They began to remember lines from a rhythm. They began to remember dances that they did in ancient times. They began to remember those ancient drum beats that they now beat out on bare skin. And so to those ancestors, we pour libation. I shave. Pour libation too to them, because they then began to teach each other. They began to resurrect and reconstruct that history and that culture. They became the new Africans wherever they were. They became the new teachers, preachers, archaeologists, the new singers, dancers, the new drummers, the new Jaliyah. They reconstructed that history and our culture and became new Africans everywhere. So to those ancestors, we pour libation. Ashe.
Asheo.
Asheo.
We always want to make sure that we acknowledge our ancestors and
Yes.
ask that you also think of your ancestors who've helped to move us along, move your family along, the community, and indeed the struggle that we've been engaging in since we've been kidnapped and brought here. Well, we do have another video that we want to share with you, and it is a video which gives highlights of what Operation is, the organization here in East New York, and how we have been working at a grassroots level to make achievements and bring services to our community. So we're going to ask.
Operation Power stands for people organizing and working for empowerment and respect.
Operation Power is a grassroots social justice organization founded by local community stakeholders, which includes activists, organizers, and leaders who understand that the system as it is currently structured is destroying us and our communities.
The system, the capitalist system, one that promotes human greed over human need, one that promotes profit over people, needs to be dismantled. These local community organizers recognize capitalism needs to be destroyed and replaced with socialism.
Operation Power was founded in 1997 with the understanding that uprooting capitalism needs to begin locally. Operation Power understood that our communities are the perfect vehicle to dismantle this parasitic capitalist system brick by brick, and the economic, political, and cultural institutions and other systems in place in our local community infrastructure. Whether it's the local school board, community board, city council, state assembly, all represents mechanisms to control the destiny of our people.
Ashe, thank you so much. We also want to highlight 3 books that have some personal collection for us in Operation Power. And the first one is called Speaking Truth to Power. And the author is none other than Charles Barron. It is a collection of articles and essays that have been written over time. The second one is called It's Not You, It's Capitalism. Why It's Time to Break Up and How to Move On. And is written by Malika Jabali. It is both a primer and an extension of the view of capitalism. The next one is a novel written by Kevin Barron, and it's called Black Rising. It is a page turner. Once you start it, you will not put it down until you finish. The second is the second in the trilogy called Black Rising, Home and Abroad, again by Kevin Barron. And it continues the theme and the characters that were introduced in the first book. And the third book in the trilogy is called The Threat, and it's a continuation of the first 2 books. We invite you to get these books online through Barnes and Nobles, and you'll be glad that you did. We do have an announcement. We want to make sure that we acknowledge the passing of Mother Khadija Farrakhan, the wife of the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. She passed recently, and we were able to send our condolences and express our condolences. I just want to share that with you. As we mourn the passing of Mother Khadija Farrakhan, it is with heartfelt condolences that we express our love and support for Minister Louis Farrakhan and their children. We send our deepest sympathies to the Nation of Islam and the believers. Not only was she a blessing to her family, but she had a loving impact on all the nation and the world. May she rest in peace and paradise with the Almighty God, Allah, for a job well done. So we just wanted to make our expressions there. Well, we're about ready for our program, but we do want to let you know that we've got an exciting piece that's in addition to our program. So at the conclusion of this hour, we invite you to stay tuned because there will be an additional part that will be played. It's a part of offering a piece that we did for Organizing is the New Cool.
The New Cool.
And we were asked to be a part of that organizing effort, and we did make a presentation. So that will be aired after the conclusion of our program. But right now, we've got our guest, Dr. Gerald Horne, who is an instructor, professor at the University of Texas. He's joining us. He's been with us many times before, and we are always excited to hear him. We did have an occasion to hear him in person when he came to New York about a week ago.
Excellent.
It was an excellent, exciting presentation. As we expected, we were enlightened. Our eyes were open to other things that we had not known. Of course, you're not going to hear them in the mainstream media. So we're excited to hear what he has to say for us this evening. America's 250 years of hypocrisy. Welcome, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Dr. Horne, this is a very important topic. You know, we mention it a lot. As a matter of fact, Malcolm always talked about democracy, hypocrisy, and it's been like a little saying, but not a real deep discussion and entry into what do we mean by the hypocrisy? What do we mean by democracy? So we're going to play a little quick clip of Malcolm X where he talked about it in relationship to justice in the courts in America, but internationally and domestically, hypocrisy reigns supreme in American policies.
And then the criminal who attacked the victim accuses the victim of attacking him. Yes, sir. This is American justice. Yes, sir. That's right. This is American democracy. Yes, and those of you who are familiar with it know that in America, democracy is hypocrisy. Right. Now, if I'm wrong, put me in jail. But if you can't prove that a democracy is not hypocrisy, then don't put your hands on me.
See, we wanted to get into that question of the hypocrisy because, you know, America, one of the things the capitalist system has, which I think is quite powerful, and that is the propaganda machine and how they begin to define things. Matter of fact, they frame issues. And if you don't watch out, you'll jump into the frame and become a part of an irrelevant debate. But this question of hypocrisy, it goes all the way back. Like right now, they're even talking about they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. Yet Israel has 80 nuclear warheads that nobody talks about. America has 7,000. Russia has thousands of what? America is the only country in the world that dropped an atomic bomb on another nation, Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the 1940s in Japan. But this hypocrisy runs from the very beginning, where you did an excellent classic on 1776, the counter-revolutionary of 1776. But they were talking about independence and being democratic and being a fighting against the colonialism of England, when in fact they were setting up domestic colonies right here in America in Black communities. So let's talk about the hypocrisy from the very beginning.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, it's embedded in the Declaration of Independence. Unfortunately, many of the so-called patriots fail to mention that that declaration speaks of so-called merciless Indian savages. In other words, these settlers are crossing the Atlantic to take their land, supposedly in pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they're denouncing the people who refuse to have their land stolen. Now, you can call it hypocrisy. I mean, there are a number of descriptors you can apply. then all men are created equal. Now, even if we just keep it in the frame of men, well, obviously that did not apply to the indigenous and did not apply to the Africans to begin with. And the Bill of Rights, which many of our friends on the left tell us helps to vindicate genocide against the indigenous, helps to vindicate mass enslavement of the Africans, supposedly because of these vaunted civil liberties. But you don't have to drill down that deeply to see the hypocrisy there. For example, the First Amendment speaks of freedom of religion, but you don't necessarily have to be a historian to recognize that the settlers had a mighty task in terms of subduing the indigenous, keeping the Africans in line. So they needed every warm melanin deficient body they could find. And so therefore they welcomed folks who were being persecuted in Europe for having different religions, such as the Jewish minority in Europe, for example. Now, instead of taking that sort of materialist analysis, the folks, even some on the left, they take what we would call a philosophically idealist position. They say that this idea of freedom of religion, it really comes from the brains of these Enlightenment intellectuals, as opposed to the material conditions they faced on the ground in terms of trying to subdue these indigenous, which leads us to the Second Amendment. Obviously, the right to bear arms did not apply to the indigenous population. Indeed, a strategic objective. Actually, cowboy movies have dealt with this. A strategic objective of the settlers was to keep weapons out of the hands of the indigenous.
That's right.
And as regards the Africans, slavery would have ended well before 1865 if Africans had the right to bear arms, for example.
That's right.
So the whole country is based upon a lie. I mean, that's why, without tongue in cheek, we refer not to the 4th of July, but the farce of July.
That's
and
right.
Oftentimes in my classes, when I begin the semester, I start with the beat from Entume. You recall the beat from You, Me, and He?
Right.
With the refrain being, because we're living a lie. And I tell the students, I'll give you a bonus if you can tell me why I'm playing Entume in this first class. And if you can recite his heroic words of we're living a lie, and we are indeed living a lie.
You know, and then two of the biggest lies, one, Christopher Columbus discovered America. All of our children are being taught that. And Lincoln freed the enslaved Africans. These are two of the biggest lies taught to our children.
Well, as is well known, the freebooter and pirate and enslaver Christopher Columbus never reached the North American mainland. He reached as far as the Bahamas. And in any case, even the most patriotic of analysts are discarding the term discovered because it makes no sense. I mean, it's like somebody comes to New York who's never been there, and they say, I've just discovered New York City in 2026. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. And what was the other point you made besides? Oh, yeah, Lincoln. Yeah, Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 was a war-fighting measure. That is to say, I've talked about, many people have talked about it, in fact, that as of 1862, during the U.S. Civil War, the Lincoln government was not necessarily prevailing. And so they decided to inflict a mighty blow on the so-called Confederate States of America by encouraging Black men in particular to desert the plantations. Du Bois called it the General Strike. And 200,000 then joined the Lincoln Army, and that turned the tide. And what others have pointed out is that this was not necessarily anything new. What helped to trigger the revolt against London in 1776 was that the last colonial governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, Virginia at that time was the wealthiest settlement It helped produce a disproportionate number of presidents, starting with George Washington, for example. And Lord Dunmore, in order to suppress restiveness amongst the settlers, starts the Ethiopian Regiment in 1775, wherein, like Lincoln, decades later, he promises freedom to the Africans who joined the Ethiopian regiments and helped to suppress the restiveness of the slave owners, just like Lincoln in 1863 did the same thing to suppress restiveness amongst the enslavers and their supporters. And why this is not taught to our children is obviously negligence of the first order.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned Du Bois and the general strike. I was reading that just recently, and he was saying that Lincoln actually went to the South and said, hey, listen, I'm not trying to abolish slavery. And matter of fact, if I catch any of your enslaved Africans out there, I'm going to colonize them. Because he wanted to colonize us and send us back to Africa. He wanted, according to Lerone Bennett, the America to be purely white. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, what he was referring to, I'm afraid to say, was the original conception of the United States of America, which was as a so-called white republic. Even though many of our friends on the left try to tell us that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights sets a precedent that can ultimately be applied to the rest of us who were not originally included. This, speaking euphemistically, is rather creative, imaginary thinking, because they did not necessarily intend, speaking of George Washington and enslavers, to have this Constitution applied to the rest of us. For example, Thomas Jefferson, the child molesting third U.S. president, former Secretary of State, he had hundreds of slaves. He didn't take any steps to free any of his enslaved property. Right. So if he intended the Constitution to apply to the rest of us, you would have thought that he would have set a good example by freeing the rest of us. And with regard to Lincoln, I've talked about this in my book on Brazil, whereas during the midst of the U.S. Civil War, he was negotiating with the Brazilians to send us all there. And the Brazilians said, thank you very much. We have enough Black people. We don't need yours. And we all know about the story of Liberia 200 years ago, where initially the idea was to deport all the free Negroes, particularly from Baltimore, because they were suspected of assisting the British in helping to burn down Washington, D.C. in August 1814. You may recall that the third stanza of the Star-Spangled Banner speaks in explicit terms against the Black population, because in our pursuit of freedom, we were thought to be, actually correctly, willing to stab the settlers in the back. After Liberia was established with the free Negroes, then you had the Nat Turner Revolt of August 1831, and the idea was to send so-called troublesome Africans to West Africa. And then after the plot to deport us all to Brazil failed, and I should mention parenthetically that there were numerous slave owners post 1865 from Texas in particular, who fled with their enslaved Africans in tow to Brazil, where slavery wasn't abolished till 1888. And then after the U.S. Civil War, there was the plan to send us all to the Dominican Republic. That barely failed. Then there was a plan to send us as settlers to the Congo. That did not take flight. Then during the Spanish-American War of 1898, the idea was to send us all to the Philippines. That did not take flight either. And so I oftentimes tell many of our so-called foundational Black Americans who feel that these Supreme Court decisions on birthright citizenship, which barely, even though it's explicitly embedded in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a narrow 5-4 majority just a week or so ago barely put its imprimatur on birthright citizenship, which basically means that if you're born in the United States, you're a U.S. national. a footnote, a digression. You might have seen the flexibility, shall we say, of Mr. Trump, who is now pressing Congress to enact birthright citizenship, even though the Constitution, to enact an overthrow of birthright citizenship, even though the Constitution explicitly says it's okay. You saw the World Cup where a so-called birthright citizen, speaking of the man of African ancestry, who quite frankly was tossed out of the game against Bosnia and on a very questionable basis, Mr. Trump twisted the arm of the World Cup organizers to make sure that he could get back into the game. Now, his mother, who is Nigerian, somehow she gave birth to him in Nigeria, but he didn't grow up here. He grew up in the UK. But yet they moved heaven and earth to make sure he was part of the World Cup team. And this gets to the contradictions of these folks in the United States. Although ultimately contradictions are resolved one way or another. And so birthright citizenship of the 14th Amendment was meant to overthrow the Dred Scott case of 1857, where the Supreme Court said that Black people could not be U.S. citizens. It's now on life support. I would argue that next comes the attempt to deport Jamaican Americans, Trinidadian Americans, Haitian Americans, temporary protective status just removed from the Haitians in any case. Not Haitian Americans, but Haitian nationals in the United States. And then comes the big enchilada, which is the Black people who were born here, reverting back to the 19th century, because there is this reflex in this country to revert back to the origins, to the roots, which is the white republic, for example. That's one of the reasons why in law, the US Supreme Court, when they speak about the original understanding of the Constitution, they're not referring to the post-1865 Constitution, for example, which obviously incorporates birthright citizenship. They're talking about the 18th century Constitution, which gave a pass to slavery as in an attempt to establish this so-called white republic. And so until we can organize forces to overcome these reactionaries, we will be in jeopardy to a certain degree, which of course brings us to the obvious, which is that one of the ways historically we've been able to overcome these disadvantageous conditions is through lengthening the battlefield. Internationalism, aligned with the revolutionaries, for example, with the Mexican regime of the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, with national liberation movements in the Caribbean and Africa in the 20th century, etc. So, somebody just tells us that Balagoon, who I was just referring to, was born in Brooklyn to Nigerian parents and grew up in England, which is what I was trying to say. I hope that's what I did say.
You got it right.
Okay, good. So internationalism is part of the secret sauce that many of our organizations are neglecting nowadays.
Dr. Horne, when you spoke in Brooklyn, you referenced the ineffectiveness and the illegality of the executive order that was written by Lincoln, where he said that those slaves that were held by the states that had succeeded were freed. And you talked about the conditions that existed in Texas at that time. You made reference again, as you did just now, talking about Mexico and how Mexico was so much involved in what was going on at that time. If you could refresh that or bring that up again so that people would get an understanding of what the executive order said and why it did not apply to those states that had already succeeded.
So we're referring to Juneteenth, which, by the way, I should mention, I support Juneteenth. Anytime you can get a paid holiday, I'm all for it. Because in a sense, it represents a de facto transfer of wealth when you're getting paid for not working, for example. But having said that, there's a lot of fables and fantasy attached to Juneteenth. The traditional story goes that the U.S. military shows up in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865. This is a few months after the Civil War has ended with the surrender at Appomattox, Virginia. And the U.S. Army tells the Negroes, hey, didn't you people know you were free, for example? It's a typical U.S. story because it puts our community in a bad light, even if we gained this concession of a paid holiday, for example. But actually, it doesn't take a historian to ask the simple question, which is, why were people still working for free in June 1865? I mean, shouldn't you ask the enslavers, why are you still forcing these people at gunpoint to work for free? But what was happening, as many Mexican Americans could tell us as they celebrate Cinco de Mayo, which is fundamentally a Mexican American holiday, marking a Mexican victory over a French puppet regime in Mexico City. The idea for the Texas enslavers was to continue slavery in league with the Mexican puppet leaders under Maximilian in Mexico City. But their plan was thwarted, not least because many of the soldiers in blue who were turning up in Galveston happened to be men of African ancestry. And they united in a pincers movement against the enslaving forces. Maximilian was executed unceremoniously on June 19th, 1867, which is another reason to celebrate Juneteenth, because if you find June 19th, 1865 to be questionable or even odious, well, certainly you can celebrate June 19th, 1867, which was a concrete step towards abolition of slavery. But having said that, we know that it's one thing to even have Emancipation Proclamation or even have laws that say that slavery is illegal. It's another thing to have that obtained in practice, because we know that after slavery was officially ruled unconstitutional and illegal, it came back in disguised form as a so-called convict leasing system, whereby Black men in particular are arrested on spurious charges and then leased to former plantation owners to work for next to nothing. In fact, in the Houston suburb known as Sugarland, and the name is self-explanatory in terms of being a former sugar plantation, in the last decade or so, you had cadavers of Black men uncovered who were worked to death in Sugarland, Texas, for example. And then I think I might have mentioned when I was speaking in Brooklyn, I have a book coming out in the next few weeks, actually July 21st. And among other things, this book deals with an effort by former Confederate military officers under the leadership of the regime in Cairo, Egypt, to lead an invasion of Ethiopia, because Egypt, which was nominally a colonial appendage of Ottoman Turkey to the north, had empire building ambitions all of its own, heading south towards the equator. And so the idea was to replicate in Ethiopia or Abyssinia what they had done in Sudan, which was basically turning into a happy hunting ground for enslavers. The enslaved Africans then shipped northward to Ottoman Turkey. Istanbul's slave market, or actually Constantinople as it was called then, was probably larger than that of New Orleans, for example. And so this impulse to enslave Black people has yet to dissipate, it's yet to disappear. And until we are sufficiently militant and organized, allied with anti-Yankee forces, we'll continue to be in jeopardy.
You know, speak a little bit about, because I hear often about the battle at Adwa in Ethiopia, and how a lot of African people from America actually went to Ethiopia to battle for their liberation. Because sometimes people don't understand when we say, you know, Charles, why are you talking about Cuba and why are you talking about the Sahel Revolution in Africa? we got problems right here. They don't understand that the same enemy that's colonizing Africa and creating havoc all around the world is the same enemy that's keeping us in domestic colonies called Black communities in the belly of the beast. But the Battle of Adwa was a very interesting battle. Speak on
well, first of all, the book I just mentioned deals quite a bit with Ethiopian history. Let me start towards the end and work my way back. In the 1930s in particular, when Italy, under Mussolini, the first fascist, invaded Ethiopia, you had substantial number of Black Americans and Black people from the Caribbean who took up the cause of Ethiopia. In fact, in my book, Storming the Heavens, I talk about how His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, the emperor, as he dubbed himself, his pilot was John Robinson from Chicago by way of Mississippi, for example. And a number of Black American pilots constituted the initial wave of pilots for Ethiopia. And as we speak today, Ethiopian Airways is the most significant air carrier on the continent. It's the air carrier that knits together the entire continent. In fact, one of the major projects in Ethiopia as we speak is to build a larger airport to complement the hydroelectricity plant that they just established, to the consternation of the Egyptians. But to work our way back, I also talk about in this book the fact that when you had this independent Abyssinia, it was seen as a challenge for the North Atlantic countries. And actually it was, in the sense that you might recall that when Nelson Mandela, before he was in jail, when he took his continental African trip, one of his first stops was in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for example, in addition to North Africa and Algeria. And so you had many, despite the fact that the internal conditions in Abyssinia were questionable to a certain degree. Now, I can get into that if you're interested. But the fact that it was independent and sovereign was a wound at the heart of the North Atlantic enterprise. And so therefore, at that same time, I'm talking about approximately 110 years ago, you had Black American entrepreneurs like William Ellis of Texas and Mexico. There's an entire book on him called The Strange Career of William Ellis. He was seeking to invest in Ethiopia. This is in 1910, 1911, for example. Before that, of course, you have Ottawa, which you mentioned, the 1890s, which was a mighty blow against the enslaving pretensions of the Italians specifically and the Western Europeans in general. As a matter of fact, in terms of something we should hold dear, which is the struggle against slavery, which has been a long-term project of many of our ancestors and continues today under the euphemism of the struggle against wage theft.
Right.
You can draw a straight line from the East Africans who rebelled in what is now Iraq at the end of the 9th century, for example, to the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, to Ottawa, when the Abyssinians defeated the Italian invaders, not least because of assistance from other so-called Christian powers, because Ethiopia styled itself as sort of a Christian regime, and that was not necessarily illegitimate. And therefore they were able to receive not only support from people of African descent who were in solidarity on a Pan-African basis, but also from certain Christian forces as well.
See, that's why it was so important to mention the Ethiopian struggle, because remember at the time when they were carving up Africa at the Berlin Conference, it was 1883, 84, 85, carving up, And then shortly after that was Adwa, which they held off the Italians. But that carving up of Africa and these borderlines, these lines that we have now, which is causing a whole lot of conflicts now. How do we get beyond that? I know Kwame Nkrumah was trying to get beyond that, but that is creating so many challenges now. And we'll talk more about, I want you to talk a little bit about the 1944 conference where after World War II, which is a critical conference right here in New Hampshire, the Bretton Woods Conference. But let's deal with 1883 and then get to Bretton Woods after that.
Well, it's interesting when Africa was carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey at Congress of Berlin with tiny Belgium, which just defeated the United States in the World Cup and then trolled Mr. Trump by doing his signature dance. Interesting enough. But King Leopold, the rapacious leader of this small European country, walked away with perhaps the biggest prize.
Yes.
European point of view in the sense of the so-called Belgian Congo. And to fast forward to the era of Patrice Lumumba, the first leader of the independent Congo, who was assassinated with the complicity of the US CIA in January 1961. Actually, this is not just my allegation. The CIA station chief at the time, Larry Devlin, Larry Devlin, actually wrote a memoir where he lays out in detail how they killed Patrice Lumumba. And as we speak, Congo is being ravaged by Ebola. And I'm afraid to say the latest news is that many of the health workers are going on strike. And that is of global consequence, because if you do not suppress Ebola at the source, it can easily be transmitted to this land. And Ebola makes COVID-19 seem like a Sunday school picnic to us. But it's interesting, too, in terms of the ravages inflicted upon what was then called the Belgian Congo, because remember a few moments ago I suggested that there was yet another diabolical plot to ship Black Americans to Congo, for example. This is in the context of the Congress of Berlin, the context of the establishment of the Belgian Congo, with Senator John Tyler Morgan, Dixiecrat from Alabama, thinking that we could be settlers on behalf of US imperialism in Africa, for example. You also mentioned, well, I'll skip over for the time being, the Bretton Woods meeting in New Hampshire, which helps to establish the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and these other vampires suck the blood out of Africa and the Caribbean in particular. And on a more positive note, I'll mention the Fifth Pan-African Congress of Manchester, England, attended by Kwame Nkrumah, Du Bois, etc., plots a way forward with regard to independence, which then comes in Ghana in 1957. I noticed that one of your commentators made a critique of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, which is well taken. As I said, if we had more time, I'd probably go into detail, which I do in the book, with regard to some of the, shall we say, weaknesses of his regime. But we should not overlook the importance of Ethiopian sovereignty, which then allows, as noted, for anti-colonial crusaders from Kenya to find refuge there, allows Nelson Mandela to flee from apartheid South Africa to seek counsel and support there. So let's put this in a wider context, in other words.
Very, very well put. We're in the 21st century now, and we're seeing or many of us see a declining American empire. But don't think for a second that means a weak American empire, because it doesn't. They're still very powerful. But as this empire declines, and we look at empires in the past, particularly the British Empire, the sun never set on the British Empire, and the British pound was the currency the whole world had to deal with. And now it seems like they're moving away from the dollar, and it seems like every recent murder of a leader or kidnap or attack of a land was based upon Venezuela not using the dollar, and Muammar Gaddafi using the dinar, not using the dollar. And now you see the rise of BRICS saying that we're going to use unit, a unit, and we're not going to deal with the IMF and the World Bank, even though there are a lot of contradictions there and conflicts there. So how do you see the empire declining? And if it is, what has to incline from us? Is it Sahel-type revolutions in Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, or something else?
I'll get to your question, but in terms of the one that's on the screen, the Knights of the Golden Circle, I talk about that in my Texas book, if the person who just posted wants to consult that. With regard to the decline of the U.S. empire, the evidence is all about us. I mean, look at this stunning defeat suffered in Iran post-February 28. Now, what's interesting there, to show you how complicated things are, is that right now the conflict has resumed. And it's resumed in no small measure because the Zionist lobby has put a difficult charge before the White House. The Zionist lobby has a strategic objective to overthrow the Islamic Republic, as is well known. But as a war-fighting machine, speaking of Israel, they don't want to stop there. They also want to attack Turkey. Right. Mr. Trump just came from Turkey, as you know, for the NATO summit. He authorized the selling of F-35 jets to Turkey, which will complicate any war-fighting measure that the Israelis would like to put forward. And so fundamentally, the Zionist lobby and the Israelis are tailing the White House. And I know it's like the tail wagging the dog, but so be it. You're either going to have to attack Iran or you're going to have to attack Turkey. Mr. Trump probably has some sort of deal with Turkey to line his pockets and line the pockets of Eric and Don Jr. You might recall that he got that $400 million flying palace from Qatar, the Persian Gulf monarchy, which is very close to Turkey. Recall that when Saudi Arabia was eyeing ravenously Qatar during Trump 1.0, that it was the Turks who came to the rescue of the Qataris, for example.
Sure did.
So it does not appear that Mr. Trump is eager to attack Turkey. But he's going to try to reverse the tides of history by resuming this conflict with Iran, which is not going to end well for the United States of America, which brings me to the nub of your point, which is that yes, the empire is in decline. It has one foot on a banana peel and the other in a grave. Ostensibly, that should be good news for Black people in the United States. But if you're not aware of what's going on, you can't take, it's hard to take advantage of what's going on if you're not even aware of what's going on. And that's the problem, because many of our intellectuals, our organizations, they don't pay that much attention to what's going on outside of the United States. Now, I can see that for common, ordinary, working class people who are trying to pay the bills. What about these intellectuals? What about the leaders of organizations? This should be their job. What about the elected officials? This should be their job, for example. And so the prospect is that as the empire declines, the rulers will try to take more out of our hide to compensate for what they're losing abroad. And that's the real danger that we're facing. Now, I think we can circumvent that danger, but it's going to have to take a certain kind of awareness. We're going to have to be aware of what's going on. You know, I do this broadcast every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern about international affairs. One of the points that I mentioned last night is that there was just a summit between the leaders of India and Japan. I mentioned that about 15 or 20 years ago, I did a review essay of this book, which is very interesting, called When China Rules the World. And in the context of that review essay, I mentioned that one force that could disrupt what now seems to be evident, that is to say, China replacing the United States as the leading power, could be this Japan-India condominium, which stretches back to the founding of Buddhism. I mentioned that during the so-called Tokyo war crimes trials of 1945, 1946, there was an Indian judge on the judicial panel. When the Japanese defendants entered the courtroom, he stood up, as opposed to the defendant standing up when the judge enters the courtroom. There's been this long-term relationship between Japanese capital nowadays and technological ability and Indian labor, for example. But if people don't know what's going on, they don't know what door to knock on. I mean, we're just like wisp in the wind in the middle of a hurricane.
You know what's very interesting is the imploding of the Democratic Party, the two-party system that colonial capitalism really keeps in power, the imploding of the Democratic Party and the imploding of the Republican Party domestically. These two parties that represent the colonial capitalist system, not only domestically, but also internationally, are imploding as internationally the American empire is declining. So now the response for the 51.2 million African people in America and the importance of connecting with the Sahel revolution, where we're seeing 3 countries rise and others, Chad and a few others, are looking to follow suit. Africa seems to be central to the liberation of all of us in the diaspora, and particularly on the continent with its resources that supplies the whole world with everything the world needs. So it seems to me, as you said, if we would wake up and say, hey, if we can do something in the belly of the beast and connect with the continent of Africa, that is the most powerful, resourceful continent in the world, some good things could happen.
Well, that brings me back to the issue of Turkey and Israel, because it's a danger that conflict will be played out on African soil. Recall that in terms of the Mogadishu-based Somali regime, the Turks are the power behind the throne. They pick up the garbage, they execute airport security, they educate Somali youth in Istanbul, whereas the breakaway province of Somaliland has recognized Israel, for example. And there's a danger that a conflict between the Mogadishu-based regime and Somaliland could draw in, or there'll be proxies, actually, for Israel and Turkey. And speaking of Turkey as well, they're playing a major role in many countries that have substantial Islamic populations. I just noticed in a news flash today, you mentioned Burkina Faso, that the Turks are building a major hydroelectric facility right now in Burkina Faso, for example. And of course, Burkina Faso has a substantial Islamic population. In fact, these religious zealots who call themselves Muslim are now tormenting the Sahel nations, speaking of Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, for example. And that's where we could, speaking of Black Americans, could enter the fray. But once again, you have to be aware if you're going to try to take advantage of all these openings. If you're not aware, it's like the openings don't exist.
That's one of the reasons why we're so pleased to have persons such as yourself come and break it down to us, give us the history behind it, and talk about the interrelatedness of our plights and how we've got to come together and become first aware, and then talk about strategies and what's the best way for us to move forward. And we're so pleased that you do grace our airways so often.
And if you can, Dr. Horne, as we're down to our last 5 minutes, how do we, Africans in the belly of the beast, take control over our communities, particularly where we're in the majority communities, like in 2.3 million Black people in New York City. You know, there are Black people that are the large majority in cities, and some very important cities. It seems that if we fight for that internal self-governance, at least take control over these cities, at the same time, some will prefer to build alternative institutions as opposed to taking over any city, but building alternative institutions. And you know, there's always talk about our consumer dollar of over $1 trillion, 1.2 trillion. It is not a gross domestic product because it's not united like that, but it is a consumer dollar. So how do we use that consumer dollar, the 51 million? We're in the belly of the beast, and we got to get rid of neocolonialism domestically and internationally. But how can that play a major role in our liberation?
Well, as they say in London, this is like bringing coals to Newcastle by telling Charles and Inez Barron about the necessity for grabbing political power. First, you seek the political kingdom, as Kwame Nkrumah once put it. Politics helps to forward us economically, for example. City council posts, such as something you can speak to with some persuasiveness. Assembly posts, which is something both of you can speak to very persuasively. And then seeking to knit together an alternative political machine, if I can use that term.
That's it. No, that's it.
As I said, I'm bringing coals to Newcastle. I mean, I'm telling, I'll stop here because I'm telling you people what you already know.
No, I mean, that's very, very important, because in addition to that, we also need, outside of the electoral arena, to be able to build those independent institutions, whether it's a independent organization that builds cultural institutions and that builds economic institutions, and not Black capitalism, but a form of, Black socialism or economic socialism, some kind of a economic cooperative, collective. Like I was just telling people today, I was talking to people how Zoran Mamdani talks all that socialist stuff, but here he is with $125 billion city budget. And there's two socialist ideas in that budget that we were a part of when we were in, and that's called community land trust, where the community owns the lands and don't give it to the private corporations, and worker cooperatives. Out of the 125 billion, you put 1.2 million in community land trust. That's the kind of stuff that has to stop. But take us out on some historical importance of us supporting the Sahel Revolution and supporting independent Black radical revolutionary militant politics in the belly of the beast.
To circle back to what I was saying at the top, it's no accident, it's no coincidence that Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid, begins to retreat as Africa and the Caribbean are surging towards independence. I think that should be a dead giveaway for the reality. Our struggles are united, for example. And as noted, secondly, given the fact that despite our 50 plus million, we're still outnumbered to a certain degree, since the country is about 340 million.
Correct.
Which means, once again, looking at history and looking at how our ancestors under similar disadvantageous conditions lengthened the battlefield by engaging in acts of solidarity with Haitian revolutionaries, with Mexico, once again, with rising African Caribbean nations, the socialist camp, etc. Unfortunately, what happened about 70 odd years ago is that many of our liberal leaders and organizations led by the NAACP decided to toss overboard the internationalists led by Paul Robeson, for example, in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has now been gutted and eviscerated by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so what that should tell us is that a guarantee, to the extent that guarantees are possible in this perilous world, is not necessarily the passage of legislation, although I support the passage of progressive legislation.
Right.
The ultimate guarantee is being organized and militant and internationalist. And that's the lesson we have to imbibe.
Wow. Great note to end on. We run out of time, but organizing, militant, that's what we need, Dr. Horne. Thank you so much, as always.
You.
And you have such a busy schedule, but you always grace us with the presence here. So stay tuned now. Right after this, it's going to be about organizing is the new cool.
Right.
And what a piece that Kalonji Changa put together, not just our section, which is going to be shown next, but through the whole 3 days, he put together everybody that you can think of that had anything to say about culture, politics, and the liberation and revolution for Black people. Stay tuned next.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. We look forward to having you come again. So much a pleasure.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And as we say each week, the truth shall set you free, and power is the great equalizer. Black power.
Black power. Stay tuned. Don't go anyplace.